Featuring Robert Bryan.
Hey, welcome to the Robert Bryan Podcast. Today with me is a very special guest and friend of mine, author Gary York. He's written a few books, he's been in a few movies, done a lot of different things, but mostly he's familiar with some of the military stuff and some of the things that he runs into in the law enforcement field. Hey, Gary, welcome to the show.
Listen, I really appreciate you having me on. It's an honor, and I thank you very much. It's good to see you.
Hey, it's my pleasure to have you on here, Gary. I mean, you're aware that I had some military injuries, and that's how I went blind. So the VA's decided, hey, this podcast thing is going to be a great thing. It's going to be good therapy. It's going to make you feel better. Well, they're right. So now I get a chance to feel like a celebrity and interview people like you who've done a lot of good writing and things out there. You've written a couple books, haven't you, Gary?
Yes, I wrote, after my corrections career, I wrote some true stories of Florida crimes that occurred in the Florida state prison system based on my investigations, cases I actually investigated as a prison inspector. I wrote Corruption Behind Bars and Inside the Inner Circle. They're both available on Amazon. But people told me, hey, you need to write about what's really happening behind those prison walls. So I did, and from there on, I've kind of bloomed into a few different avenues.
Absolutely, and you also were in a real life movie episode under Ben Stiller. You worked on that movie. Escape from Dannemora. Is that the way to pronounce that?
Correct. I was contacted by Showtime. One of their folks said Ben Stiller was looking for real correctional officers to play certain parts. And they saw my book that I just showed you, Corruption Behind Bars. And right. Because I asked them, how did you find me? And they said, through your book. So they found me on Facebook. I didn't have my Facebook private back then, and they were able to locate me and send me a message. And I went up, they paid me to come up and do episode 5 as a correctional officer control room operator. Hey, not a long part, but I was very honored to be in the show.
Yeah, and you've got to do 3 little parts like that, then they'll get you into some bigger parts. It's all a process, just like the military. You were actually a former MP and had raised to the rank of a sergeant, I believe it was.
Yes, I did 10 years in the United States Army Military Police. I made it to staff sergeant, and probably could have had a pretty good advancement career the last 10 years, but I didn't want to leave my small children. They were 2, 4, and 6 years old, and I had to make a decision at the 10-year mark: stay in the military and finish it, or miss 10 years of their life by, I would have seen them, but you would be traveling all over the world. So I, after 10 years in the military police, I got out of the service and became a correctional officer in a state prison in Florida.
Okay. See, and there's the influence. I have one child and one what I call my nephew's son. His mother passed away from breast cancer, and she asked my wife and I to raise him. Which we did. He's pretty good. He works for the utility companies now, traveling around building big bases for the high tension towers. I can understand you're wanting to leave, but you still stayed in law enforcement in a way with the corrections departments, which brings me to my next question. Have you ever had to work with any blind arrestees?
Absolutely. I have worked, and my wife as well, because she retired from corrections also. We have both worked with the deaf, the blind, amputees, maybe missing a leg. We had one incarcerated person who was missing both arms. We have worked with this type of incarcerated person quite a bit in the state prison system, and later with the Polk County Sheriff's Office jail here in Polk County, Florida. And I'm going to tell you, you have to go to work to provide care custody and control of inmates. And I want to make this perfectly clear. Care, custody, and control. We should never go in there to not provide them with the necessities they need. We should not go to work and think I'm going to abuse someone today. Unfortunately, those things happen. That's why I wrote about it. But we always went to work with the attitude, hey, we want a day where if we can help somebody, that's a good day for us, but a better day for them. And I'm going to tell you, the incarcerated folks, especially the handicapped, blind and or handicapped in some way, when you help them out, they never forget that because they know the next officer that comes on duty may not be so helpful. So they need a shower. Hey, officer, I haven't had a shower in 3 days. Well, let's get you in there. You should have had one. Let's get you in that shower. And we will get some orderlies, as we call them. These are inmates who are lower level minimum custody, and they'll help. I say, orderlies, come here. Let's take him, and my wife would be with the females, him or her, to the shower. Let's get him showered and make sure he has clean clothing, and make sure they're all set so that at least we know they're all set until we come back from our 2 days off. We can check on them again. When you have officers that do that little bit of extra, especially for the blind inmates or the handicapped inmates, two things happen. Not only those inmates are very appreciative, the other incarcerated people see you helping them. And I'm going to tell you, I know there can be some bad criminals in there, but when they see an officer helping the other handicapped incarcerated, they kind of get a little soft heart in there, even the hardened criminals, and they will respect you. And when you go to them and say, hey, we got to clean this dorm, folks, they run and grab everything and clean it for you with no problem. But if you go in there like a RoboCop and all inmates are terrible and you do this, you're not going to do very well, and you're not doing very well for the population that's incarcerated either.
Right. See, and that's very understandable. And I guess that's what a lot of your books are about is these true life experiences. Did the just because an inmate is blind or an amputee does not make him any less dangerous, does it?
No, and you're absolutely right on that. Now, they may be blind, they may be an amputee, but I'll tell you what, they're taken advantage of sometimes by the inmate populations, since you bring that up. Why would one of the handicapped or blind inmates be involved in a crime in prison or jail? Well, we have some of the inmates that take advantage of them. They say, hey, we're going to use your false leg or your amputee leg that was made for you to hide drugs in there. They're less likely to check you because you're handicapped. Or we're going to use your wheelchair to hide drugs inside, in the components of the wheelchair, or your cane. And when you're a handicapped or blind inmate, it's kind of hard to defend yourself against these other inmates that do this. As an officer, if I see a handicapped or blind inmate being used by other inmates for wrong things, it is my duty to intervene and make sure they are not being abused or used by another inmate.
Absolutely. I should be surprised at myself because I'd been doing some medical things in my lifetime, and I've worked with law enforcement. I never would have thought of putting things in a wheelchair or an amputee's leg prostheses. I didn't even think of that until just now you mentioned it. It just shows the experience you have with being in law enforcement, the things you've got to take care of and notice, protect yourself, all those things. I'm glad to say that after all those years, you safely retired. Thank you for all your service, Mr. York. There's a lot of people that appreciate it. There's many officers out there that work hard like you that are dedicated to protect and serve the general public. There's a couple bad apples out there, and those are the ones that officers like you catch, see that they get prosecuted, and they pay for their misdeeds. Um, you in your books, I'm not sure. I should be ashamed of myself because I tried to get them all in. I have an autographed copy of one of your books. My wife won't even let me touch it. So I have to use a Zoom text reader to read these things. Are your books going to be available in an audible format?
I think I need to do that. And you're probably pushed me over the edge. I've had people say, get your books in Audible, please. And I like to listen to it while I drive down the road. But, you know, from what you and I have just talked about, you've really sparked something in my mind that I need to do. If we're talking about helping the blind, and we should have more Audible books. And Amazon, where my books are located, do have the Audible option.
Oh,
I could hire a narrator or just read it myself, chapter by chapter, and we can get it on there. So I think you sparked me to do something new and do an Audible
okay.
book.
Great. There is actually, now I'll help you a little more. There is a program called Clipchamp. I'm not sure how you would use it with the books, but it will do a text to voice streaming. Um, it would be a matter of downloading your book and have to print it. I use on my computers a program called Zoom Text, Fusion Zoom Text. It
Okay.
reads and I can talk to it. Um, it, for some reason, was trying to summarize one of your books. You also co-authored a book as well, if I'm not mistaken. I wanted
Yes,
to.
I have co-authored several books. The most recent that I just have next to me is Homicide in Prison by Dr. Joshua Long. He's a professor, and I have a chapter in the book, and then I'm mentioned throughout the book on several of my quotes. He told me one day, he said, Gary, there's a lot of death and homicide and suicide in prison, unfortunately. I don't see anybody telling the truth about that. Would you work with me on this book? So, Homicide in Prison by Dr. Joshua Long. And I've done a couple of other co-authored books. I actually even did one with a prior convicted felon who got out of prison, changed his life. I believe in second chances, folks. I'm not one of these that thinks once you've committed a crime, oh, you're finished with me. I'll never want to talk to you again. We need to give second chances to people. There are people incarcerated that can turn the tide and change back to being a good, prominent citizen, and this one did that. So he asked me to do a dialogue for his book. I didn't co-author it with him. I did the epilogue for his book. And I thought,
Okay.
wow, here's a person that got out of prison asking me, a former law enforcement officer, to do the epilogue in his book. So maybe I'm doing something right somewhere.
You absolutely are. I'm proud to say I can call you a friend too. It's just it's like the blind. I was in such a state of depression. The VA wasn't sure what to do with me. I was to the point of becoming suicidal. And this was after I had originally met you. I just my sight went. I mean, I was used to working on heavy equipment, driving big trucks, and boof, it's just like it spiraled quickly to where I couldn't see anything. So I had to change, but I didn't want to change. I was bitter. I was mad at the military, mad at the public. They didn't understand my issues. There was no real resources. Well, boy, was I wrong. There's resources. People just don't know about them.
Right.
They're not publicized. They're not out there. So because they don't find these resources, we wind up with homeless vets on the street. We wind up with people that are visually impaired that have no place else to go. They wind up, God knows, I pray for the souls. They commit suicide and things. They commit crimes, like you said. It's just the resources that are out there need to be brought to the attention. And in your books, I just found a lot of interesting information that if people really knew about some of the things that happened in prison, I think they might think twice about wanting to do some things. these people that run around because money's tough right now, and they feel, well, I don't have any place to go. So they run out and they bounce checks all over town. Well, those wind up putting them in prison. And there's no difference between a check bouncer and a guy who's created some violent crimes in there, I don't believe. Jail is jail, prison is prison. Maybe the killers are put on death row, but there's some violent criminals that are in there. And I think you talk about some of that in your books.
Yes, I do want to tell people, how do I know about these stories? 12 years of my career, I was an investigator for the state of Florida prison system. So I investigated criminal, civil, and administrative investigations throughout Florida. That's how these stories came about, true cases that I actually investigated. And I have interviewed incarcerated people who are victims of other inmates. The more violent, more severe inmate who raped a guy who was just in there for bounce checks, and he wasn't there to bother anybody, and they took advantage of it. And the poor guy, I feel like, there's nothing I can do but do the investigation to try to move this person to a safer place. But no matter what prison you send somebody to, it's still prison. But we did everything we could to protect them. But it's a sad thing to see them. It makes you think, God, I wish I could get you out of here. In my mind, I can't tell him that would be like, why are you telling an inmate you want to help him get out of prison? That's not a good thing to say. But in my mind, as a person, now that I'm retired, because I have feeling, I can truly say there was times when I thought, God, I wish this guy could get out of here, and maybe go on probation for writing those checks, or go on probation for smoking that marijuana instead of suffering in here with this abuse.
Yep, I understand. Yeah, I mean, with the corruption things, I mean, does it affect like inmates as well as the correction staff with the corruption, or?
Yes, when you have corrupt correctional officers, of course they take the image of the honest officers, but the corrupt officers endanger everyone. An honest officer will tell you they cannot stand a corrupt officer, because I tell stories of how officers smuggle in drugs, marijuana. A maintenance man smuggled in a gun to Charlotte Correctional Institution down south in Florida. When you go across the line and help some of these criminals with their drug ring from the street to the prison, or bringing weapons in, you're endangering not only the officers, but the civilian staff and the other inmates who do not want to participate in these crimes. So it's very dangerous when an officer helps an inmate to commit crimes.
Right. And the endangerment, I mean, it's not the bad officers that get in trouble most of the time and become endangered. It's the good officers. And some of the inmates that aren't such a danger, they also become endangered with all this corruption in there.
Correct, because they're the ones that will get hurt. They'll be in the middle of trying to stop. Well, an officer tries to stop an inmate who's taking those drugs, and he's gone off the wall, as we say, and you have to stop him somehow. And that inmate turns and assaults the officer and hurts them. Or turns on another inmate and assaults and hurts them. So the innocent get hurt on both sides of the house with this corruption.
I think a lot of people don't understand. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to be in a cell for a year, let alone maybe 10 or 15 years. The cabin fever that must come with that is, I guess they call it being closed in so much. They get a little yard time for exercise and to get some sunlight and stuff, I guess, in prison. But there again, is that where a lot of the corrupt things happen? They move stuff off back and forth between the different cell blocks. Have you touched on any of that stuff?
Yes, there are stories in here that will explain in detail how they got the drugs in, where they hid them, how they did it, and you will see that the inmates that are in prison and the officers that are around this type of corruption and death and and killings and drug use, because you're trying to help these inmates recover, right? And then these guys
Right.
are smuggling drugs in, putting them right back in the same situation they were on the street. Um, Post-traumatic stress disorder is not just found among the correctional officers, which is very high among correctional officers, by the way. It is
Oh, I didn't
found
know that.
among, it's found in formerly incarcerated inmates. Inmates come out of prison with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, fear, that it does affect the incarcerated population as much as it affects the officers that are subject to this.
Yeah. I mean, have you had unfortunately witnessed like an inmate that had hung himself in a cell or anything like that?
Uh, well, there's we're trained for suicide prevention, but unfortunately, several times in our career, there's been inmates commit suicide,
Wow.
and we have to do rounds. Some every 30 minutes, some areas 20 minutes, some areas every 10 minutes. When an inmate commits suicide, a huge investigation obviously begins. First of all, we want to make sure that the rounds were done properly, because if the rounds were not done properly, we have an officer that failed to do their duty, and there's a problem there we have to take care of. We also want to find out why were there any signs of the inmate before he committed suicide that should have been picked up on by staff so we could prevent it.
Right.
It's a sad situation with the suicides in prison and in jails. It happens in prison and jail. We cannot stop all of them 100%. People always say, well, why not? That's your job to stop those suicides. Well, they're correct. It's part of our care, custody, and control. But when you have a prison with 1,000 to 1,100 inmates, such as Polk Correctional Institution here in Florida, and you have 26 officers on duty, tell me how you can cover every single nick and cranny of the prison. You can't do it.
You can't. You can't. It's like suicide is people think, oh, you could have prevented it, but look at let's mention a celebrity, Robin Williams. Nobody would have ever thought he would take his own life, but he'd been going through depression for years. But people that want to commit suicide, they'll smile in your face and know you're not going to be back for another 30 minutes, as you guys say you make your rounds. They sit there and smile at you, and as soon as you're down the corridor, then they do what they want to do. Depression is a horrible thing. Um, that's why I was almost going to ask you if you were ever thinking about putting some of your stories to a script and maybe do a movie about some of this stuff to really enlighten the public on some of the things and the tragic stuff that occurs in prisons and the corruption.
I,
I think if people knew what was going on, maybe they'd be better to hire actual civil servant type deputies rather than to keep privatizing here and privatizing there. I feel I'm kind of against privatization of certain things. Some things are fine to privatize,
I
but
agree.
like corrections, you have to have people who are compassionate, not somebody that's just there to get a paycheck and they could care less. People that are actually there, they're in service to their country, so to speak. It's just a professional way to do things. I don't think the training comes from just hiring an outside company. Um, I'd love to see you write a book about that, but I don't know what your view is on it, Gary. And I don't mean to bring that question out. Boom, here it is, because I know I sent you some of the questions we were going to talk about. But I mean, what do you think about the privatization of that stuff? Do you think it's a good thing, a bad thing?
I have always been against privatization of prison.
Thank you for listening to the show. We hope you will like and subscribe to our channel. Be sure to visit our website. Until next time, take care.